Imagine the northern wind biting at your cheeks, the way it cuts across the fjord and rattles the pine branches, and for a moment you close your eyes and let that sound carry you back to another time, centuries ago, when winter in Scandinavia was not a season of cozy lights and soft blankets, but a test of endurance, a slow and relentless trial that shaped the lives of those who dwelled there. You hear the crunch of snow beneath worn boots, the distant call of a raven circling above the frozen shore, and you can almost taste the smoke that clings to the thick air from the hearth fires where families huddle together, waiting for dawn that comes so late and departs so early. If you are listening now, lying down and letting this story surround you, leave a like, share it with someone who would also feel its weight, and comment where you are hearing it, because what you are about to step into is not just a tale, but a journey into the breath and heartbeat of a world half forgotten, a winter world that still whispers in the dark. Life in Scandinavia during the long winters was governed by rhythm, not of clocks, but of the sun that barely rose and the storms that swept across the land with ice in their teeth. Imagine the farmstead, wooden walls blackened by smoke, thatched roof heavy with snow, and inside, the creak of timber as the cold tried to seep in. A mother stirring thick porridge of barley and dried berries, her hands red from cold water, her breath visible in the dim air, while children sit wrapped in wool, learning from their elders the sagas that told them who they were. Outside, the air was sharp, dry, and filled with silence so vast that every crack of ice on the lake sounded like thunder. You, as a listener, step into the role of a traveler, a wanderer who has come upon such a homestead after days of walking through endless white, your fur cloak heavy with frost, your feet aching, yet your spirit strangely calmed by the stillness of this land. They invite you in, not because they know you, but because hospitality is survival here, and no one is left to the cold without shame upon those who turn them away. The food is simple: dried fish softened in milk, bread made from barley and rye, a slice of goat cheese that carries the tang of summer pastures now buried beneath the snow, and a cup of warm ale spiced with juniper that brings heat to your chest. Each bite is not indulgence but endurance, each swallow a reminder that the earth provides, though sparingly, if one works with patience. As you sit by the fire, you notice the light. It flickers yellow against carved wooden beams where runes are etched, charms against misfortune and frost. Shadows dance across the faces around you, the old man whose eyes still carry the sea within them, the young boy who cannot sit still, his mind already dreaming of voyages and hunts, and the woman humming softly as she spins wool, her voice rising and falling like the wind outside. The sound fills the room, a lullaby against despair, and you feel time slowing, as if winter itself holds its breath. Yet beyond the walls, danger is never far. Wolves prowl the forests, hunger gnaws at those with poor harvests, and the sea, always the sea, waits with its icy waves for those who dare to fish too far from shore. You sense this tension when the men speak in low tones, planning tomorrow's journey to check the traps set for hare and fox, their words broken by the occasional creak of the door as the storm presses against it. They talk of neighbors, of news brought by traders who pass through despite the weather, carrying stories from distant lands where the sun shines longer. One such story drifts into your ears as if carried by fate, a tale of merchants from the south, who bring strange spices and fabrics never seen in these parts, and of how these same merchants whisper of kingdoms rising and falling, wars brewing far from this frozen world, yet somehow connected to it. The thought lingers with you, even as warmth seeps into your bones, for winter in Scandinavia was not isolation alone, but a pause before journeys, a silence that held within it the seeds of change. The night stretches on, and outside the wind howls like a beast denied its prey, but within the wooden hall there is comfort. A bowl of stew thick with root vegetables, seasoned with salt gathered in summer, fills your stomach, the texture rough, the taste earthy, reminding you that even in scarcity there is flavor, and even in darkness there is memory of the sun. A girl sits beside you, her hair braided with a strip of wool dyed red, and she asks, almost shyly, what lands you have seen, what waters your eyes have looked upon, and in her curiosity you hear the spirit of a people who, though surrounded by ice, always look outward, to horizons beyond their fjords. You tell her of roads and markets, of cities where stone towers rise instead of timber, of songs sung in languages she does not know, and her eyes widen, reflecting the firelight like pools of amber. In that moment, you understand why sagas exist, not just to recall the past, but to feed the hunger for more than what the long winter allows. Yet as dawn approaches, faint and grey, a shift enters the room. The old man clears his throat, his voice rough as oak bark, and he speaks of omens, of a raven seen circling thrice above the village, of ice forming in patterns that resemble spears, of dreams where the sea swallows ships whole. His words hang heavy, and though some laugh them off, you notice the silence that follows, as if everyone feels the truth hidden within. The fire crackles, sparks rising like fleeting stars, and you realize that beneath the surface calm of this winter night, there is a current of unease, a question left unspoken. What change waits beyond the snow, what storm brews not in the sky, but in the hearts of men? And as you prepare to rest, wrapping yourself in furs that smell faintly of smoke and pine, you hear it again, the wind against the door, persistent, insistent, almost like a voice calling. You close your eyes, wondering if it is only the storm, or if it is the world itself, whispering that soon this quiet life will be touched by something greater, something far beyond the fjords. And with that thought, we end this night's chapter, leaving you to drift into your own dreams, warmed by fire yet unsettled by the shadows it casts, knowing that when the morning comes, a new story begins, one that will not stay contained within these wooden walls, but travel outward like news carried on the wind. Would you, if you lived then, have braved the silence, or waited for the change to arrive at your door? The morning after the storm breaks with a pale light that seems more shadow than sun, a weak glow that seeps across the horizon like milk poured into dark water, and you wake to the creak of wood, the smell of damp wool, and the faint sound of someone splitting logs outside, steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. The cold is still there, clinging to your bones, crawling through every crack of the hall despite the glowing embers in the hearth, yet there is also the quiet determination of those who have lived through such winters countless times before, who know that each day survived is a victory in itself. You step out into the biting air, your breath blooming white in front of you, and see the snow piled high along the wooden walls, the roof sagging beneath its weight, and the sky so low it seems to press upon your shoulders, making the world feel smaller, heavier, almost as if you are walking inside the chest of some slumbering beast. The man at the woodpile pauses, wipes his brow with a hand wrapped in rough wool, and nods toward you without words, for in this season speech is often reserved, breath saved for labor rather than idle talk. Soon the others emerge, the young boy clutching a crooked stick as if it were a spear, eager to prove himself, the women carrying buckets of ice to melt for water, their fingers raw and red, and the old man leaning on his staff, watching with eyes that have measured many winters, each one leaving its mark in the deep lines carved into his face. Life here is measured not by grand events, but by the small rituals of survival, the gathering of firewood, the checking of snares, the careful rationing of dried fish and smoked meat hanging in the rafters. You follow them to the storehouse, a low structure half buried in snow, where the air smells of salt, tar, and cold stone, and inside you see rows of barrels sealed with pitch, filled with herring caught before the seas froze, their silvery bodies preserved in brine, each one a promise against hunger. The boy asks if you have seen cities where food is piled high in markets, where fruit lies in baskets even in winter, and when you nod he stares, silent, as if unable to imagine such abundance, his world limited to what the sea, soil, and forest provide. You can almost taste his yearning, sharp and bitter as frost. Later, you walk with the hunters into the woods, where the silence is broken only by the crunch of boots on crusted snow and the distant tapping of a woodpecker on a frozen tree. The forest feels endless, branches heavy with snow, shadows deep and still, and every sound seems magnified, every breath echoing in your ears. They check the traps, simple loops of sinew and would set near burrows and tracks, and from one they retrieve a hare, its fur stiff, eyes glazed with the glassy sheen of death. The boy's face lights with pride, though the creature is small, scarcely a mouthful when shared among many, yet here every morsel counts, every success is celebrated. The men speak of larger hunts, of elk and reindeer, of journeys across the mountains where the snow lies like a shroud, and though their words carry bravado, you sense the undercurrent of fear, the knowledge that each hunt is a wager with fate. The return to the homestead brings warmth once more, smoke rising from the chimney, the scent of stew simmering with root vegetables and scraps of dried meat, The sound of children laughing as they chase each other across the packed earth floor, their bare feet quick despite the cold. You sit again by the fire, feeling its heat seep into your skin, and watch as the woman ladles stew into wooden bowls, the broth thick and fragrant, carrying the sweetness of carrots stored in the cellar and the earthy taste of turnips. The first spoonful warms your mouth, the second your chest, and with each swallow you feel strength returning, though behind the comfort there is always the awareness of scarcity, of how carefully each portion is measured, of how fragile this balance is. As the night deepens, stories return, spoken softly over the crackle of flames. The old man recites a tale of Odin wandering in disguise, of trials and gifts, of knowledge gained through suffering, and the children listen wide-eyed, their faces glowing in the firelight, while outside the wind rises again, rattling the shutters, making the house groan as though alive. You realize that these stories are more than entertainment. They are anchors, keeping fear at bay, weaving meaning into the long nights, binding each person to something larger than themselves. You begin to notice the details of their rituals, the charms of bone and wood hung above the doorway, carved with symbols meant to ward off ill fortune, the way they place a bowl of broth outside for the spirits, a silent offering to forces they cannot see but deeply respect, the songs the women hum while spinning wool, melodies older than memory, carrying the rhythm of lives tied to the seasons. And you feel, in the marrow of your bones, how survival here is not merely a struggle against nature, but a dialogue with it, a constant negotiation between human will and the vast, indifferent landscape. Yet whispers of change stir, even in this frozen world. One evening a traveller arrives, his cloak stiff with ice, his beard thick with frost, and his eyes weary from the road. They welcome him, as custom demands, and as he warms by the fire he speaks of ships, of traders who come from across the sea even in winter, bringing tales of conflict and riches, of kings in the south whose ambitions reach farther with each season. His words drop into the room like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of unease through the listeners, and you feel the shift in the air, the sense that these isolated fjords are not as distant from the wider world as they once seemed. The boy asks him about battles, about swords and shields, his voice trembling with eagerness, and the man answers with grim detail, describing the clang of iron, the smell of blood on snow, the cries of men echoing across valleys. The boy's eyes shine, filled with dreams of glory, while his mother looks away, her lips pressed tight, her hands gripping the wool she spins as though to steady herself against the weight of such visions. Outside, the night grows colder, frost creeping like fingers across the window panes, and the fire burns lower, yet no one moves to sleep, held captive by the pull of stories that stretch beyond their fjord, beyond their winter, into a world of shifting power. And as you listen, you feel the old man's earlier words returning to you, of omens, of ravens, of seas swallowing ships, and you wonder if the change he sensed is already here, knocking at their door with every traveller, every whisper carried by the wind. You lie down once more beneath heavy furs, the scent of smoke and pine clinging to them, your body warmed but your mind restless, for in the stillness of the hall you hear the faint sound of something beyond the storm, a distant echo like the beat of oars against water, steady and unrelenting, as if somewhere out on the dark sea a new chapter is already being written. As the deep winter carried on into its heaviest stretch, the people of Scandinavia found themselves moving in a rhythm that was at once harsh and strangely comforting, for though the wind screamed across the fjords, and the forests stood silent under their burden of snow life, did not halt, it only slowed into something measured and deliberate, and in this slowness each soul felt the weight of tradition, and the unbroken chain of those who had lived and endured before them, the men waking before the sun to tend to animals huddled in barns warmed with hay, the women lighting the first embers of the fire with practised motions, the children blinking awake beneath layers of furs, while frost etched patterns onto the wooden shutters outside, and all of this together created a harmony between necessity and endurance that few outsiders would have understood, yet to those born under the northern sky it was as natural as breathing and as binding as fate. The days often passed in muted tones of grey and white, with the sun crawling weakly across the horizon and vanishing too soon, leaving villages bathed in long twilight, and then in darkness. But the darkness was not empty, it was filled with sound, the creak of sleds drawn by oxen or horses over frozen ground, the steady beat of axes striking wood in preparation for more fires, the murmur of voices in workshops where craftsmen worked by lamplight, shaping wood into tools, skis, sled runners, or bowls. Carving patterns into bone or horn and hammering iron into nails, hooks and blades for winter demanded not only food and shelter, but also the tools to keep both intact and usable. Outside the villages, hunters tracked silently across frozen marshes, their breath clouding before their faces as they followed the prints of elk or reindeer through the snow, and the skill of these men was not merely in strength, but in patience and respect, for every kill was sacred, for every life taken meant life preserved back in the village. And so when the hunters returned dragging heavy carcasses on sleds, the people greeted them with gratitude, not celebration, for the balance between man and nature was never forgotten. Meanwhile, fishermen braved the edges of the icy seas, their boats rocking in swells that threatened to freeze the blood in their veins, yet they cast their nets again and again, pulling up shimmering fish that would be dried, smoked, or salted to last through the coming weeks, and the smell of smokehouses lingered in the crisp air, a sign that survival was being secured day by day. Inside the homes, the women spun wool into yarn, weaving heavy garments dyed in natural colors, browns, grays, muted blues, and reds, garments that would serve not only the living but sometimes the dead, for even funerals took place in the dead of winter, burials delayed by frozen ground, and solemn processions through snowdrifts where voices carried hymns or chants into the cold air, and even in grief there was acceptance, for death was as much a part of winter as life was, and the people did not fear it. They simply acknowledged it as another turn in the endless cycle. Storytelling grew ever more important during these months as families gathered close by the fire while storms raged outside, and the old told tales that were as sharp and alive as the crackling flame, sagas of ancient warriors who braved the seas in dragon ships of gods, who walked among men in disguise of great beasts that roamed mountains now hidden in snow, and of ancestors whose courage carved a path for those who lived now. And these tales were not just stories, they were lessons coded in memory, ways of teaching the young that the hardships they faced were the same hardships their forebears had overcome and would be overcome again. Festivals too marked the season, particularly during midwinter, when fires were lit and feasts prepared from what little could be spared, when neighbors gathered in halls to sing, drink mead, and remind each other that even in the harshest months joy could be found and bonds could be strengthened. And though the nights were long, laughter rose high and echoed through wooden rafters, blending with the howling winds outside to create a sound both defiant and comforting. Traders, though rare, sometimes appeared, bringing with them furs from far-off forests, amber from the Baltic shores, or news of other lands, and even when their arrival meant only a small exchange of goods, the presence of an outsider reminded the villagers that the world beyond still existed, though the snow tried to cut them off from it. And so curiosity mixed with caution as people listened to stories of cities, markets, and distant wars, while clutching their cloaks tighter against the familiar cold. Children continued to play, their spirits unbroken by frost. They skated across frozen ponds with bone skates strapped to their boots, rolled snow into shapes that mimicked animals and men, and hurled themselves down slopes on wooden sleds, their laughter piercing the grey quiet like a song of defiance against winter itself. And in watching them, the elders felt hope stir quietly, for if the young could laugh through such cold, then the future of the people was assured. Yet hunger always lingered as a shadow over every home as the weeks dragged on and supplies dwindled. Meals grew smaller, bread stretched with bark or ground roots, broth thinned with more water than meat, and sometimes fasting was necessary to keep children fed, while adults endured empty stomachs with grim resolve. But even in this there was dignity, for sharing was the law of the land, and no family could hoard while others starved without facing the judgment of the community. And then came the nights when the sky burst alive with the aurora, shimmering curtains of green, purple, and silver that danced across the heavens, and every soul, whether farmer, hunter, child, or elder, stood transfixed in the snow, watching as if the gods themselves sent signs of endurance and promise from beyond the stars. And in those moments silence reigned, not from fear, but from awe and a deep sense of belonging in a world both brutal and magnificent. Slowly, though imperceptibly, the nights shortened, the sun lingered a little longer on the horizon each day. And though the cold did not yet relent, the people felt the change in their bones, hope stirring as surely as sap in the roots of sleeping trees, and they knew that no winter, however cruel, could last forever, for spring waited patient and certain, and with it new work, new growth, and new stories to carry forward into the next generation, just as had been done countless times before. As the fourth stretch of winter pressed its grip upon the Scandinavian lands, the people felt themselves suspended in a season that seemed both endless and fragile, as though the world had been locked in ice and silence forever, and yet at the same time might shatter into change at any moment, for the snow lay heavy upon the roofs, and fields, the forests groaned beneath its weight, and the seas raged with storms that sent walls of spray freezing upon the rocks. But within the village's life pulsed with The stubborn rhythm of survival and resilience that centuries had carved into their bones, and in this rhythm each task carried both necessity and meaning, whether it was the chopping of wood that echoed through the cold valleys, or the weaving of wool by lamplight, or the carving of runes into beams and tools to mark not only ownership but faith in powers older than memory. Men ventured still into the forests with skis strapped to their boots, gliding across frozen ground as silent as the owls that watched them from branches, and they tracked elk or reindeer whose coats blended into the snow, and when they felled such beasts with bow or spear, it was not with triumph, but reverence, for the meat meant life, and the hide meant warmth, and the bones would become tools or ornaments, nothing wasted, nothing dismissed, and when hunters returned, dragging their quarry on sleds, the village gathered not in cheer, but in solemn gratitude, for, in such a season, each life saved another. On the coast fishermen risked their lives daily against the fury of the North Sea, rowing through waves that cracked against their hulls and froze in sharp crystals upon their beards, casting nets heavy with ice into waters that could swallow them whole, and yet they did so because they must, and when they returned with barrels of herring or cod to be salted, and smoked, the women lit fires, and the smoke curled upward into the steel-grey sky, carrying with it the promise of endurance. Inside the homes the hearth became the center of existence, the glow of the fire lighting faces lined with hardship, yet also softened by closeness, for families huddled together in warmth, and shared what they had: bowls of broth, porridge of oats, bread dark, and heavy meat stretched thin but enough to sustain, and as they ate they told tales of gods and ancestors, of long voyages across the sea, of heroes who faced winters harsher still and conquered them not with strength alone but with patience, cunning and unity, and the children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations painting firelit visions upon the walls of the hall, while outside the wind screamed as if to test the walls themselves. Craftsmen continued their tireless labor, shaping sleds that would glide across snow, sharpening axes, hammering nails, repairing fishing gear, and carving figures of animals, gods, and spirits into wood and bone to keep faith alive through the months of darkness, for they knew that idleness bred despair, and despair was the true enemy of winter, more deadly even than frostbite or hunger. The elders spoke often during this season, their voices carrying both wisdom and warning, reminding the young that winter was not only a time of cold but of reflection, that one must listen to the silence of the snow and the groan of the ice, for in them was the voice of the land itself, and to ignore it was folly. And the people listened because they knew survival was never only physical but also spiritual, a balance between the body's needs and the soul's endurance. Festivals punctuated the long nights, especially during the turning of the year, when fires blazed in the central hall and torches lit the paths between houses, and songs rose in voices that shook the rafters with defiance against the endless dark, and though food was scarce, a feast was prepared with what could be spared: dried meats, smoked fish, bread, and mead brewed from honey stored since summer. And in those hours laughter returned to lips wearied by hunger, and song returned to throats hoarse from silence, and for a night the people remembered joy as vividly as hardship. Sometimes travelers still appeared, moving with sleds across the snow-covered roads, carrying news from other settlements or goods for trade: pelts of fox, wolf, or bear amber, gleaming like captured sunlight, small trinkets of silver or iron. And though such visits were rare, they were treasured, for they bound the isolated villages into something greater than themselves, a network of endurance stretched across the vast white silence. The children, in spite of the hunger and cold, found ways to turn the snow into a playground, rolling great balls into shapes that became giants or beasts, sliding across frozen ponds, their laughter cracking through the heavy air like sparks of life. And even the sternest elders could not watch without a small smile, for the resilience of youth was itself a lesson that winter could not extinguish hope so long as voices still rang with joy. Yet there were days when hunger pressed heavily, when the bread was stretched too thin, when mothers gave their share to their children, when men tightened belts and bore the ache in silence. And on those days the strength of community was tested, but rarely found wanting, for sharing was law. And though disputes rose, they were quenched quickly, for the people knew that selfishness was death, not only for one but for all. Then came the nights when the heavens burned with fire, the aurora spilling across the sky in veils of green and violet and silver, and the people left their halls to stand in the snow breath, rising in clouds, eyes wide with awe, for in those shifting lights they felt the presence of gods or ancestors, or simply the vast power of a world that dwarfed their own, and in that presence the cold seemed for a moment to lift, as though beauty itself was a warmth greater than fire. Slowly, almost unseen, the sun began to linger, longer shadows shortening ever so slightly upon the snow, and though the air was still sharp enough to cut the skin, the people sensed the change deep within their marrow, for winter, no matter how endless, always yielded to spring, and so they endured the final stretch with grim patience, sharpening their tools, patching their nets, telling their stories, and waiting for the day when ice would crack, water would flow, and green would pierce through white once, more reminding them that no darkness, no frost, no hunger could hold forever against the cycle of the world and the unbroken strength of those who called it home. Through the fifth and hardest turn of the northern winter, the people of Scandinavia felt themselves walking a narrow path between despair and endurance, as though each day stretched into an eternity of grey skies and white horizons, yet still they pressed on with a quiet strength that had been shaped by generations who knew that the cold was not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to be endured and respected, and so they rose each morning into air so sharp it bit the lungs and stepped into landscapes where sound itself seemed frozen, muffled by endless snow that covered earth, forest, and field alike, binding them into one vast stillness that only the wind dared disturb. The men left their homes while darkness still clung to the valleys, carrying axes, bows, or fishing gear across their shoulders, for though the sun offered little warmth, and appeared only briefly, they could not afford to waste a moment of its dim light, so hunters pushed into forests, where the trees groaned under their icy burden, following the faint tracks of deer, elk, or wolf across frozen streams, and through thickets where silence ruled, broken only by the crunch of boots or the distant cry of a raven circling above, and when the hunt succeeded the return was slow but sure, dragging sleds heavy with carcasses, while frost rimed their beards, and the villagers gathered not to cheer but to bow heads in quiet gratitude, knowing that each animal meant nights of food and clothing for many. On the coasts men rowed out against seas that seemed determined to swallow them alive, the waves rising like walls, the spray freezing on their faces, and the nets turning stiff with ice, yet still they cast again, and again, their arms aching, their bodies trembling as the weight of the sea fought against them, and when at last fish filled their boats, the relief was not joy but solemn triumph, for they had faced the fury of the sea and lived, and that was enough. And back in the village, smoke-houses blazed, filling the air with the scent of preservation cod, herring, mackerel, strung up to dry, while the women salted and stored each catch with hands reddened from the cold. Inside the longhouses the fires never died, for flame was life itself, and the hearth was the heart of every home, where women spun wool dyed with roots and berries woven into garments thick enough to keep the cold from biting too deep, while children sat near weaving small toys or helping mend nets and tools, their laughter rising now and then, though hunger kept it softer than in the bright months, and the elders spoke as flames crackled, telling tales of times long past when gods walked among men, or when heroes braved winter's darker still and carved kingdoms from the ice with sword and faith. And in these stories the people found not only escape but also strength, for memory itself was a kind of shield against despair. Festivals continued even in hardship, especially at midwinter, when fires were kindled high enough to push back the dark for one long night, and feasts were prepared with what little could be spared: smoked meat, broth thickened with grains, bread hard, but shared among all, and mead poured in small cups that warmed the heart as much as the body. And in those gathering songs were sung, some old as the stones, others newly made, yet all carried the same defiance. Laughter rang against wooden beams, and their children danced in circles around the fire, while outside the storm howled unheard, for inside the people remembered what it meant to be more than survivors. They were a community bound not just by blood, but by shared trial and unbreakable spirit. There were moments when despair crept close, when the stores ran low and hunger pressed sharp upon stomachs, when mothers gave their share to their children, and men tightened belts to endure the ache in silence, when tempers flared in the press of cold and darkness. Yet such moments rarely lasted long, for all knew that division was death and unity the only shield against the frost. So disputes were settled swiftly, food shared even when little remained, and no door stayed shut against a neighbor in need, for the unwritten law of the land was clear: what one endured, all endured; what one gained, all gained. Still the winter gave its gifts of beauty, though harsh, for the skies at night often erupted in fire, the aurora spreading across the heavens in veils of green, violet, and gold that shimmered like the banners of gods, and the people would step outside, no matter the cold, to stand in silence, staring upward, their breath rising in silver clouds, their hearts beating with awe, for in those lights they felt small yet also infinite, part of a world that was vast, brutal, and magnificent beyond measure, and in that beauty they found the strength to last one more day, one more night, one more storm. Children turned even the snow into joy, sliding down hills on wooden boards, throwing snow that sparkled in the weak sunlight, building shapes of animals and giants from the frozen world around them. And though hunger sometimes slowed their games, their laughter was like sparks struck against steel, bright, fierce, and unyielding, and in it the elders saw the promise of survival that no winter could erase. Travelers rarely came in such months, yet sometimes a lone figure appeared, pulling a sled heavy with furs or amber, bringing word from distant settlements, and though the people greeted such arrivals with caution, they welcomed them with warmth, for hospitality was survival itself, and guests carried not only goods but news stories and songs that bound villages together across the frozen expanse, reminding all that though the snow tried to isolate them, they were never truly alone. The craftsmen worked tirelessly, shaping wood, bone and iron into tools, sleds, ornaments, and weapons, for idleness was a slow death, and even beauty was necessary for the soul, so carvings of gods, beasts, and runes adorned everyday items, not only for function but for faith, and every stroke of the knife or hammer was an act of resistance against despair. As the weeks dragged on and the stores thinned further, the people watched the sky for signs of change, noting when the sun lingered just a little longer, when the horizon glowed with a light less pale than the day before, and though the cold still bit deep, hope grew in their marrow, for they knew that winter, however endless in its grip, would always yield to spring, and already they began to plan for the thaw, repairing tools, preparing seeds, setting aside what could be spared for the moment when soil would soften and rivers would run again, and life would return in green and gold. And so through storms that howled like wolves and nights that stretched like eternity, the people endured with patience, unity, and quiet strength, for they knew that the frost could not last forever, and that their survival was not only of this winter but of all winters past, and all those yet to come, carried forward in stories, songs, and unyielding hearts bound to the land that tested them and the sky that watched over them, and though the snow still lay deep and the nights still long, they endured. And in enduring they triumphed, for to live through winter in the north was not merely survival, it was victory, and the proof that their spirit, like the land itself, was unbroken. As the sixth part of that endless Scandinavian winter unfolded, the people found themselves suspended in a strange in-between state, where the worst of the storms had already passed, yet the land remained locked in its icy silence. And so each morning they awoke to a horizon painted in shades of pale blue and silver, with snow stretching so far that the eyes could barely find a boundary between earth and sky, and the air itself seemed thinner, as though the world had been reduced to its most essential elements of cold breath and stubborn survival. Yet even in that starkness life pressed on with a rhythm steady as the beating of a drum beneath layers of fur, and while men and women stepped outside into a world that crackled beneath their boots, each sound carrying sharply in the stillness, because there was no leaf, no stream, no bird to soften it, and they followed the routines that their ancestors had followed before them, cutting holes through ice to fish from lakes where the water gleamed black and unfathomable, or venturing into forests with axes to fell trees that would warm the hearth for weeks to come, while their children scurried to gather kindling, their small bodies wrapped in cloaks almost too heavy for them to carry, yet their laughter echoed when one stumbled into the snow, and the others pulled them free, brushing frost from red cheeks. Inside the longhouses, where thick walls of timber kept out the worst of the cold, the daily hum of work continued with a rhythm both monotonous and comforting. Looms clattered as women wove cloth patterned with runes and stripes, reminding all who saw them of the order hidden within the chaos of nature, while others shaped clay into vessels hardened by the fire to store the last of the dried berries and grains, and children sat close to the fire, sharpening small tools or tracing lines in the soot as they listened to stories murmured by their grandparents, whose voices cracked with age, yet carried the weight of memory older than the village itself. Each night the aurora returned in veils of light green and violet, spreading across the dark sky, and the villagers often stepped outside in silence, heads tilted back and breath rising in frozen clouds, to watch the heavens dance above them, and though hunger gnawed and the cold bit, they felt for a moment part of something vast and eternal, as if the gods themselves were whispering through the colors, promising that the earth would not remain silent forever, and that warmth would come again. The hunters brought back tales as well as meat stories of wolves prowling in hungry packs, bold enough now to approach the edges of farms, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark, or of elk moving in restless herds searching for grass beneath the snow. So the men set traps and kept their weapons close, not from fear but from knowledge that winter demanded vigilance as much as strength, and often the sound of a bowstring snapping in the forest echoed like the heartbeat of the land itself. Among the people faith was as much a part of endurance as food or fire, so offerings were still made at small shrines of stone, and would tucked into groves, or standing at the village edge, bowls of broth or small carvings left in hope that the spirits who ruled wind and frost would show mercy, and mothers whispered blessings into the hair of their children before sleep, calling on gods and ancestors alike to keep the little ones safe through the long night. And in this ritual there was both fear and comfort, because to honor the unseen powers was to remember that survival was never only of flesh but of spirit. Yet not all was solemn hardship, for the heart needs laughter even in the deepest cold, so games were played in the snow races with sleds carved from wood, or contests of strength, where men lifted heavy stones slick with frost, while others gathered to sing songs that mixed joy and defiance, their voices rising into the night and bouncing back from the frozen hills as if the land itself was singing with them, and sometimes a feast was made though the portions were smaller than in other seasons. But the taste of hot stew, the smell of roasted meat, and the warmth of shared cups of mead gave courage enough to carry them through another stretch of days. As the weeks moved on, small changes appeared almost invisible at first, but felt deeply by those who knew the land so well. The sun lingered a heartbeat longer above the horizon. Each day shadows shifted slightly, birds long gone returned in twos and threes, testing the air with cautious wings, and even the ice on the rivers began to groan as though warning of the flood to come, and though the cold did not relent, hope stirred in every chest like a spark hidden beneath ash, waiting for the wind to bring it to flame. But hope alone could not feed nor clothe, so preparations for spring began. Even while snow still clung to the earth, tools were mended, seeds sorted, fishing nets patched, and sharpened stakes carved for new fences, for when the thaw came the work would be furious, and none could afford to be unready. So winter was both hardship and teacher, reminding the people that survival was not only endurance but foresight and discipline, that tomorrow could only be won if today was used wisely. In this season, the role of community showed its deepest worth, because no family stood alone. Neighbors checked one another's stores of food, elders offered advice drawn from lifetimes of winters survived, and if one household faltered, others shared even their meager stores, because they all understood that the strength of the whole was greater than the strength of the few, and that to abandon one was to weaken all. So the people of Scandinavia lived through the sixth part of winter with patience and resilience, watching the horizon with eyes sharpened by hunger, but softened by faith. They told stories, they worked, they prayed, they sang, they laughed when they could, and when the wind rattled the roofs, and the snow fell heavy again, they huddled close to the fire, and whispered to each other not only words of fear but of promise that the frost would not last forever, and that spring, though still distant, was already on its way. And in that quiet certainty they endured one more night and one more day, awaiting the moment when the land would awaken again. The seventh part of the winter in Scandinavia deepened into a chapter so vast and heavy that it seemed to erase the memory of warmth from the minds of the people who endured it. For as the endless snow kept falling and the darkness stretched its hands across the land like a great shroud, life became an unbroken struggle balanced against beauty, hardship, and the deep knowledge that their ancestors had lived through the same, and left them the lessons to carry on. The wind came from the north like a beast unchained, rattling the shutters of wooden houses, carving drifts so high against walls that doors vanished beneath them, and each morning the villagers woke to a silence broken only by the sound of shovels, sledges, and the distant crack of ice shifting on lakes and rivers that lay frozen under a sheet so thick it could swallow sound. Yet in that silence the people moved with purpose. The men rose before the pale dawn to cut wood, for fire was the truest wealth of winter, and without its crackle no child, no elder, no traveller could survive, so axes rang through the woods with a rhythm that echoed like heartbeat against the pines. The women tended fires, boiled water hauled from holes cut in the river ice, and ground the last of the grains into coarse flour, baking bread that smelled faintly of smoke and earth. Children carried wood, cleared paths, and learned from their elders that every hand, no matter how small, was part of the chain that bound the community together. Food was scarce, and the memory of autumn harvests seemed like a dream from another world. Each smoked fish, each strip of dried venison, each sack of barley or rye was counted and guarded with care, and yet when a neighbour's store ran empty, the village gave what it could, because to let one family fall was to weaken them all, and the bond between them was stronger than hunger. Hunters vanished into the forests where the snow hung heavy on branches like sleeping giants, and they followed tracks of deer, elk, or hare with patience so great it seemed they became part of the forest itself. When they returned dragging their kill upon sledges, their faces raw from frost, the whole village gathered to meet them, children running ahead, dogs barking with excitement, and though the hunters never boasted, their eyes shone with the pride of men who had stolen life back from the jaws of winter. Fishermen too braved the coast, rowing small boats through waters that churned like black iron under the pale sky, nets stiff with ice, and they pulled from the sea what they could, though each journey was a gamble with storms that rose without warning. Many returned with their catch, some returned empty, and a few never returned at all, leaving widows and children to carry the memory of their courage. Within the halls and houses, where the smell of pine smoke and wool lingered, the elders told stories by firelight, sagas that stretched back into times when gods walked the earth, when giants roamed the north, when men first crossed seas in longships carved with dragons. These tales were more than words. They were lessons wrapped in myth, reminders that suffering had meaning, that every hardship carried the seed of honor, and that no winter, no matter how long, could erase the spirit of a people bound to land and sky. The children listened wide-eyed, their shadows flickering on walls, and though sleep pulled at them, they carried those sagas into their dreams, where Thor's hammer cracked like thunder above the mountains, and Odin's ravens flew across endless skies of fire and ice. Craftsmen worked by lamplight, carving wood into sledges, bowls, and toys, shaping iron into tools, repairing weapons dulled by the hunt, and weaving patterns into cloth that carried not only warmth but also meaning, for each line and not echoed runes of protection, fertility, or memory, and to wear such garments was to wear the prayers of those who made them. The women at the looms sang as they worked, their voices low, steady, almost like the hum of the earth beneath snow, and those songs carried through the walls, weaving warmth into the very air. There were festivals, too, though food was rationed and music was often only voice and drum. At the heart of winter came the feast of Yule, when evergreen branches were hung within homes, when candles burned through the night, when people gathered in halls to share what little they had in defiance of hunger and darkness. For Yule was not about plenty but about hope, about reminding each other that the sun would return, that the wheel of time never ceased its turning. During these nights the aurora danced most brightly, veils of green and violet rippling like silk banners across the frozen heavens, and villagers stepped outside, their breath rising in clouds, their eyes lifted to the sky, silent and reverent, for in those lights they saw messages, blessings, perhaps even the footsteps of the gods themselves walking above. The children laughed and pointed, the elders bowed their heads, and the hunters stood still as trees, their faces lit in colors no fire could match. Yet winter was not only beauty but also trial. Storms swept down from the mountains with such fury that roofs tore away, and animals vanished beneath drifts. Avalanches roared across slopes, burying forests in silence deeper than death. Wolves prowled close to the villages, their eyes burning in the dark, their howls chilling even the bravest hearts. Sickness crept through huts, silent and merciless, taking the frail and the old. When fevers rose, women brewed teas of pine, juniper, and honey, whispering prayers with every stir of the pot, while shamans painted runes of protection on doors and chanted to spirits, but still some were carried away, and each burial in the frozen ground was marked with solemn words and the promise that their names would not be forgotten. Yet even in grief, the people endured. Children's laughter still rang as they slid down snowy hills on sledges made from old planks. Lovers still met in quiet corners, their whispered words carrying warmth that no frost could kill. Neighbors still gathered to mend nets, sharpen axes, and plan the next hunt. And always the fires burned, glowing red against the dark, a promise that no night could swallow them whole. Travelers who braved the snow and reached a village were welcomed with food, warmth, and a bed, no matter how poor the household, for hospitality was not merely kindness but law, for tomorrow it might be their own sons or brothers wandering lost in the snow, and every traveler carried stories of distant lands, of other villages enduring the same trials, weaving each small community into something greater. A people bound not only by land but by shared fate. As the weeks dragged into months, the villagers marked the slow lengthening of the days. Each morning the light lingered a little longer, each evening the sky held a trace of gold before the darkness. They measured these changes not in clocks or calendars, but in the rhythm of chores, in the way shadows fell across the snow, in the way children's games lasted a little deeper into the evening. Hope grew slowly, as fragile as the first thawing drip from a roof, but it grew all the same, for they knew that spring was hidden somewhere beyond the horizon, and though winter still held them, it would not hold forever. In the silence of those months, the people learned patience, resilience, and unity. For winter in Scandinavia was not merely a season. It was a teacher, a sculptor, a force that shaped their bodies, minds, and souls into something unbreakable, and though the world beyond their fjords and forests might forget them, they knew that as long as the fires burned, as long as voices told the sagas, as long as hands worked and hearts endured, Their lives had meaning woven into the endless fabric of snow, night, and light. And so the seventh part of the winter passed, not with triumph nor with defeat, but with a quiet certainty that even in the longest night, life endured, and with life came the promise of dawn. The eighth and final part of this long, unyielding Scandinavian winter stretched before the people like an endless white page upon which their lives, their struggles, their triumphs, and their memories had been written in frost and fire, a world of sharp air, frozen rivers, and mountains that rose like ancient guardians from the snowbound earth. And yet, as the days slowly began to lengthen and the light lingered a few heartbeats longer beyond the horizon, there came a sense among the villagers that this chapter of darkness, as brutal as it had been, would soon yield to a season of thaw and renewal, and still they moved through each day with the same careful attention to life, to survival, to the intricate balance of community and solitude that had kept them alive for generations. For winter, though it could be endured, demanded vigilance, patience, and respect, and any lapse could be fatal. The morning light filtered through frost-laced windows into the longhouses, illuminating the smoke that rose from the hearths where women stirred thick stews of roots, dried meats, and the last handfuls of grains, the smell a mixture of earth, fire, and hope, a tangible promise that warmth and nourishment could still be coaxed from the frozen world, and as children pressed their noses to the glass, they watched the world outside, where the snow lay in long, unbroken sheets over hills, forests, and fjords, the occasional movement of a distant elk or the glint of a hunting blade betraying life amidst the stillness, while inside the house, laughter mingled with the crackle of firewood, a reminder that the human spirit refused to be fully subdued even in the harshest of times. Men rose before dawn, stepping into the cold that bit like invisible teeth, their breath rising in clouds, their hands red and raw beneath thick mittens as they readied sledges, sharpened axes, and repaired the small boats that would be sent out onto icy rivers or along the coastlines where waves, dark and unyielding, challenged even the most experienced fishermen. Yet the people moved with an intimate knowledge of the land, of the snow, of the wind, as though the elements themselves were a language they had learned to read and respond to, a dialogue that required constant attention, patience, and respect, and each day brought its own victories, small but vital, from the successful hunt to the repair of a roof torn by storm, to the capture of fish that would feed families for weeks, to the subtle discovery of a thaw beginning beneath the frozen soil. The hunters ventured into the forests, moving silently through groves of pine and birch whose branches hung heavy with snow, following tracks of deer, elk, and hare, their eyes trained to read the smallest impressions in the drifts, their ears tuned to the snap of a twig or the distant howl of wolves, and when the hunt was successful, they returned with their burdens carried upon sledges drawn by strong dogs, the village greeting them not with exuberant cheers, but with a quiet reverence for the life taken, which would sustain the community, and for the courage of those who faced the wilderness so fully aware of its power and danger, knowing that the smallest misstep could mean death in the silent white expanse. Along the coasts, fishermen braved waters that churned like molten iron under the pale, low winter sun, waves crashing against the sides of their small boats, spray freezing on beards and eyelashes, their hands raw and bleeding from pulling nets stiff with ice. Yet still they labored, driven by the knowledge that food meant life, and life meant the survival not just of one family but of the village itself, and when they returned, exhausted, they were met with firelight, the smell of smoked fish, and the warmth of hearth and human presence that made the impossible work bearable, even heroic in its quiet endurance. Women wove wool into garments thick enough to keep the frost from claiming flesh, each thread a combination of function, tradition, and prayer, patterns repeating ancient runes and motifs, the motion of the loom a rhythm as constant and meditative as the seasons themselves, while younger women learned at their sides, absorbing not only skill but the stories and values embedded in each line of weaving, so that warmth was not only a matter of clothing but a legacy, a link between generations, a defense against despair. Inside the longhouses, children carved small toys from scraps of wood, traced runes and symbols in soot upon walls, or listened wide-eyed as the elders recounted tales older than the hills, stories of gods and heroes, of ancestors braving harsher winters, of great ships that had crossed storm-tossed seas, of clever men and brave women who had turned hardship into triumph, and in these stories the young absorbed lessons of courage, resilience, and the complex moral weave of life, for winter was not merely cold and hunger. It was a teacher, a mirror, and a crucible, and to understand it was to understand the human condition itself. The aurora filled the skies almost nightly with its brilliant, shifting colors, greens and violets and occasional flashes of gold and silver dancing across the heavens, and the villagers would step outside despite the biting air to watch, to stand in reverent silence as the lights swirled above them, reflecting in eyes, in ice, in the hearts of all who had endured so long in darkness, a reminder that beauty and grace existed even amidst struggle, that the world, though harsh, could still surprise with moments of awe, and that even the smallest human effort was part of a larger story, one that stretched across generations and across the snowbound land itself. Each night, families huddled close to fires, sharing warmth and stories, conserving what little energy they could, for even the simplest tasks were exhausting in such cold, and yet they found moments to laugh, to sing, to play, and to express love, for survival was not merely a physical matter. It was also spiritual and emotional, and they had learned that nurturing these aspects of life was as crucial as food, fire, and clothing. Illness and injury were constant threats, and those taken by fever or frostbite were mourned quietly, with respect and rituals intended to preserve memory and honor, for life in the north was precarious, and yet in mourning there was also a reaffirmation of life, a dedication to those who remained, a promise that their effort, their suffering, and their endurance would not be forgotten. Travelers were rare in such months, yet when they arrived, they brought news, goods, and stories from distant villages, linking isolated communities through human connection and reminding each household that they were part of a larger network of endurance and knowledge, that their trials were not faced alone, and that what they learned and preserved would be carried forward beyond the limits of their own snowbound valleys. Slowly, inexorably, the signs of thaw began to appear. The ice on rivers groaned and cracked in the subtle warmth, tiny rivulets began to flow beneath frozen layers, the snow became granular, the wind softer, and the sun lingered longer each day, bathing the world in pale light that hinted at green beneath the white, at life waiting to awaken. The villagers observed these changes with quiet, measured attention, adjusting their work, preparing for planting, repairing tools, tending the last of winter stores, and teaching the children how to read the land for these subtle signals, for the success of the coming spring depended on careful preparation in the last weeks of ice. And yet, even as hope grew, the lessons of winter remained vivid. The people carried the memory of hunger, the sharpness of frost, the trials of storms, the courage required to face wolves, the endurance necessary to hunt, fish, and farm in near impossible conditions, and all of this formed a layer beneath every smile, every laugh, every embrace, a depth of experience that bound them together, village to village, family to family, generation to generation. In these final weeks, the longhouses were full not only of work but of anticipation. Children learned to watch for returning birds, to track melting streams, to observe the changing colors of the horizon. Adults discussed the timing of planting, the repair of roofs, the fortification of fences against floods, and the preparation of tools for tasks that would soon be urgent and unrelenting. Conversations intertwined stories of past winters, of ancestors whose names were remembered not because of wealth or power, but because of survival and wisdom imparted. Elders advised, younger men and women listened, children watched, and in this continuum, the community learned once more that knowledge, patience, and unity were as vital as firewood and salted fish. Throughout these months, the aurora continued to dominate the skies, sometimes dancing softly, sometimes flaring with intensity, reflecting in icy surfaces and eyes alike, and always reminding the villagers of the vastness of the world beyond, of mysteries they could not control, of beauty they could only witness and interpret through human memory and imagination, of a divine or natural presence that watched, perhaps guided, and certainly challenged them. By the end of the final part of winter, the people of Scandinavia had endured, as they always had, through cold, hunger, storms, illness, fear, and isolation. They had shared laughter, song, and warmth. They had hunted, fished, woven, carved, and prayed. They had witnessed the harshest side of nature and the most radiant displays of the heavens. They had loved and lost, taught and learned, survived and thrived, and through it all, they had become more than a group of individuals. They had become a living, breathing testament to the resilience of the human spirit against the extremes of the northern winter, a story etched into every frost-rimmed window, every smoked fish, every crackling hearth, every child's laughter, and every whispered tale in the glow of candlelight. And as the thaw approached, as the first rivers began to run freely, as the first shoots of green began to pierce the white, there was a quiet understanding among them that the hardships of winter had not merely been endured. They had been transformed into strength, into community, into knowledge, into the very soul of a people who could survive anything, because they had survived everything together, under the white skies of a long Scandinavian winter, and that the warmth, color, and life of spring, when it finally came, would feel all the more vivid, all the more precious, all the more alive, because it had been earned with patience, courage, and unity. As the snow finally began to recede from the slopes and valleys of the Scandinavian wilderness, the villagers emerged from the cocoon of winter with bodies stiff but hearts strangely buoyant, for the long months of darkness and cold had forged a rhythm to their lives that no spring could erase, a rhythm measured not in hours or days, but in breaths of ice-laden air, the creak of sledges over frozen lakes, the hiss of boiling water over hearths, and the quiet murmur of voices shared in warmth and toil. And as they stepped into the light, the world seemed transformed by both relief and wonder, the mountains gleaming pale and soft under the returning sun, rivers running with a gentle roar, carrying reflections of the awakening sky, and the air itself, once biting and harsh, now held the faint promise of new growth, of green beneath the thawing soil, of the first shoots of grass and leaves that would soon pierce the melting snow. The people moved slowly at first, savoring each sensation, the crunch of their boots on icy remnants, the warmth of sun on cheeks red from winter, the sweet smell of damp earth and pine as the forest shook off its blanket of frost, and as they wandered along paths newly revealed, they observed the traces left by animals, the delicate tracks of foxes and deer, the marks of birds returning from south, and the silent evidence of wolves that had skirted the villages, reminders that life had persisted, quietly, unseen, alongside them, in a delicate balance of survival and coexistence. Within the villages, fires burned in longhouses with renewed vigor, and meals became larger, richer, celebrations of endurance, the last of winter's stores combined with early foraged greens, smoked fish, and bread, and as families sat together, the stories of the past months were recounted, not with despair but with a sense of awe at their own resilience, each person recognizing the collective strength that had seen them through darkness, hunger, and the cold that gnawed at every bone. Children, their cheeks now flushed with freedom from the harsh frost, ran through yards and along riverbanks, discovering patches of exposed soil and shallow streams, laughing as the ice cracked beneath their weight, learning through play the contours of the land as it transitioned from winter to spring, their energy a living testament to the survival that had been nurtured even in the hardest months. Hunters and fishermen returned from forays that had tested every skill and nerve, their hands scarred, faces weathered, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a task completed. The meat, fish, and furs they carried symbols not merely of provision but of courage, precision, and intimate knowledge of the land and its rhythms, and as they distributed their catch among families, there was no boasting, only quiet pride, gratitude, and acknowledgment of a shared struggle that bound them closer than words could convey. In the villages, women continued their weaving and spinning, but now their patterns hinted at renewal, incorporating symbols of growth, fertility, and the turning of the seasons, colors subtly changing as new dyes became available from roots, berries, and herbs that had survived under the snow, and in each garment and blanket, warmth carried not only physical protection but the stories, prayers, and history of the people, a living tapestry that connected the present to both ancestors and children yet to come. Elders wandered slowly among the younger, imparting lessons learned from winters past, speaking of careful observation of the sky, of wind patterns, of animal behavior, of the timing of planting and fishing, and these lessons were absorbed with quiet reverence, for every word carried the weight of survival, of memory, and of a world that was neither static nor forgiving, a world that demanded respect and attention, yet rewarded those who could read its language. The festivals and Yule celebrations of winter gave way to small gatherings in the first warmth of sunlight, songs replacing stories, dances echoing in courtyards where snow had melted, laughter spilling freely as the community celebrated endurance and the return of life, Yet beneath the joy lingered the memory of what had been endured, a subtle caution threaded into every game, every song, every smile, as though reminding each villager that survival was not a gift but a task renewed with every season. The forests and fjords, too, seemed to awaken, the air vibrating with the hum of unseen insects, the first calls of returning birds, the soft murmur of streams that had been locked in ice, and the people moved with them, observing, recording in memory, and preparing for the labors ahead, planting seeds, repairing roofs, cleaning tools, mending nets, and laying the foundation for the months of work that would bring sustenance in the cycles to come, each action informed by the trials of the winter just past, each motion deliberate, careful, imbued with the patience born of having waited through long nights and relentless storms. Even in moments of leisure, the villagers carried the imprint of winter on their bodies and minds, the stiffness in joints, the deep knowledge of frostbite and hunger, the empathy for neighbors who had struggled more than they had, the subtle respect for the quiet power of storms, for the ways in which the land shaped life and life responded with creativity, cooperation, and resilience, and in these reflections, children learned to see not only the beauty of the thaw, but the lessons embedded in hardship, the stories of ancestors who had endured far greater darkness, and the understanding that life, in its delicate balance, was as much about observation and patience as it was about labor and courage. Along the coasts, the ice began to break free from rocks and sandbars, the tide carrying shards that clinked like glass under the morning sun. Fishermen ventured further, cautious yet confident, nets full of new life that had survived under frozen waters, and the smell of salt, seaweed, and wet driftwood carried inland, blending with the scent of thawing earth and warming fires. A symphony of smells signaling not only the end of winter, but the beginning of preparation, planting, and new endeavors, a sensory affirmation of cycles that had sustained humanity for centuries. As the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher, the aurora faded into memory, its brilliance now a tale to be told rather than a nightly spectacle, yet its presence had left a mark on the hearts and imaginations of the people, a reminder that the natural world held wonders beyond comprehension, that even in the darkest times, light could emerge in forms both sudden and subtle, and that paying attention to these wonders was part of the fabric of life, a lesson that children carried with them into games, chores, and explorations, learning to measure not only distance and depth, but the subtleties of color, sound, and shadow that revealed both danger and promise. Villagers ventured into the valleys and fields, observing early buds of growth, the melting streams revealing fertile soil, the rocks warmed by sun where lichen and moss thrived, and with each step they noted the presence of animals emerging from winter shelter, the careful movements of deer, the cautious flutters of birds, the silent stirrings of foxes, and the occasional distant sighting of wolves, still hunting but now forced to follow new patterns as the ice receded and prey moved with thawing terrain, and all these observations informed the community, guiding hunting, planting, and the daily life that was intertwined inseparably with the cycles of the land. Inside the longhouses, conversations turned naturally from survival to planning, from endurance to hope, as families discussed the coming harvests, the preparation of seed, the maintenance of boats and sledges, and the teaching of children, who were already learning the skills that would ensure the continuation of their people, the survival of knowledge, and the transmission of culture, stories, and resilience. Each generation standing upon the shoulders of the last, looking forward even as it honored the past. In quiet moments, individuals reflected on the winter's trials, on moments of fear, isolation, and loss, and these reflections were not morbid but affirming, a recognition of capacity, courage, and endurance, and an acknowledgment that the winter had not broken them but had strengthened them in ways subtle and profound, embedding lessons in patience, cooperation, observation, and empathy, ensuring that even in the inevitable challenges of spring, summer, and the seasons to follow, they would carry the imprint of endurance, a resilience honed by months of frost and darkness. Across the landscape, villages were linked by shared stories, by travelers' news, by the common understanding that hardship had been survived and that knowledge of the land, the weather, the behavior of animals, the management of food and fire, and the rituals of protection and preparation was a shared treasure, to be preserved and passed down, and so the people moved through the early spring with attentiveness, gratitude, and anticipation. planting seeds in thawed soil, tending animals as they emerged from shelter, repairing boats and homes, and observing the subtle shifts in wind, light, and temperature that would guide their lives for months to come. By the time the snow had nearly vanished from hillsides and rivers were flowing freely, the people had learned anew that life was cyclical, that each season carried both gifts and trials, and that survival was inseparable from community, wisdom, and careful attention to the world around them. And in these final weeks, children played with abandon, elders instructed with patience, adults labored with both diligence and joy, and the land, though still harsh and demanding, revealed its potential for growth, sustenance, and beauty, a world simultaneously challenging and forgiving, a partner in human endeavor rather than an enemy. The final epilogue of this long Scandinavian winter was not merely the end of cold but the affirmation of continuity, a moment where people, land, and cycles of nature intersected in harmony, where the lessons of darkness were carried into light, where the memory of hardship informed celebration, work, and care, and where the understanding of life's fragility and resilience became a foundation upon which new stories would be written, new seasons would be lived, and new generations would grow, carrying the legacy of those who had endured, observed, learned, and loved through the long, unyielding winter, so that the white world of frost and shadow, of aurora and ice, would never be forgotten, and its lessons would pulse through the veins of the people as surely as the returning sun warmed their blood and the thawing earth promised sustenance, color, and the quiet joy of life renewed.